When Daniel lost everything, his business, his home, and the use of his son's legs, his wife slammed divorce papers on his chest and walked out. 10 years later, she stood at his doorstep, begging to come back. But the man she left behind, he wasn't broken anymore. He had rebuilt something stronger, without her. Daniel Whitmore had built his life from the ground up. A hardworking contractor in Houston, Texas, he ran Whitmore Construction with pride. His crew respected him, his clients trusted him, and his family, his wife Clarissa and their 7-year-old son Eli, was the reason he worked as hard as he did. They weren't rich, but they were stable, happy, and proud of what they'd created. That all changed in less than a year. It started with a faulty shipment of materials from a man named Richard Hale. Substandard concrete collapsed during a city project, putting Daniel's company in the middle of a lawsuit and public scandal. Contracts were canceled overnight. Debts piled up faster than he could pay them. He mortgaged the house to stay afloat, then sold his trucks, his equipment, and even his father's old tools. Nothing helped. Then came the accident. Eli had been playing outside when a delivery van backed into the driveway. The driver never saw him. The damage to Eli's spine was irreversible. He was 7 years old and would never walk again. Daniel broke, but he didn't give up. He took night jobs, repaired fences, mowed lawns. He learned how to lift Eli from his bed without hurting him. He stayed up late researching physical therapy, filled out endless paperwork for insurance that barely covered the basics. But Clarissa? She checked out. At first she pretended to help, but the guilt never seemed to reach her eyes. She grew distant, colder. Her resentment simmered just beneath the surface. And then one night she snapped. "You're nothing but bad luck, Daniel," she said, slamming a stack of divorce papers onto the kitchen counter. "You're broke. You'll be homeless within a year. And I'm done being a nanny to a child that can't walk. He's your burden now." She left that night with a man named David Langston, a real estate developer who'd been sniffing around ever since the scandal broke. Clarissa didn't even pack a full suitcase, just her jewelry, her phone, and a silk scarf she threw over her shoulder like she was boarding a private jet instead of walking out on her family. Daniel watched her go, holding Eli in his arms as the boy asked, "Where's Mommy going?" He didn't have an answer. Clarissa never called. Not once. For the next 10 years, Daniel raised Eli alone. He rented a tiny house behind a retired nurse named Grace who helped with Eli's rehab when she could. Daniel worked long hours, anything that paid. He refused to put Eli in a home. They made it work with second-hand wheelchairs, used books, and sheer willpower. He celebrated every inch Eli gained in therapy like it was the Super Bowl. But one morning, a black car pulled up outside their bungalow. A sharply dressed man stepped out and addressed Daniel by name. "Mr. Whitmore, Jonathan Collins would like a word. He says you'll understand." Daniel nearly laughed. Jonathan Collins? The young architect he once hired fresh out of school? That kid was a real estate mogul now, featured in business magazines and TED Talks. "I have work," Daniel said, brushing the cement dust from his jeans. Grace, standing behind him with Eli, gave him a gentle look. "Maybe this is the kind of work you need now." Eli looked up at him. "Dad, maybe he can help." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. When he stepped into Colin's office, surrounded by glass walls and city views, he felt completely out of place. But Collins rose from his chair with a wide smile and shook his hand like an old friend. "You gave me my start," Collins said. "Now I want to hear your story. All of it." So Daniel told him. He talked about Richard Hale, the fake concrete, the lawsuits, the foreclosure, about the accident, about Clarissa walking out. Collins listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every injustice. When Daniel finished, Collins sat back and said, "You carried all of that on your own." Daniel shrugged. "What choice did I have? You gave me a shot when I was nothing. Now I'm going to return the favor." That moment marked the end of Daniel's long descent and the beginning of something he never expected, a second chance. Collins didn't waste time. That same afternoon, he brought in his legal and financial teams. What started as a casual offer of help turned into a full-blown investigation. They combed through public records, foreclosure documents, and auction histories, anything tied to the downfall of Whitmore Construction. 3 days later, Collins walked into Daniel's small rental home with a folder under his arm. "The house you lost," he said, placing the folder on the table. "The one with the swing set in the yard, right?" Daniel nodded, unsure where this was going. "That house was auctioned off years ago. Turns out the firm that bought it was eventually absorbed by one of my holding companies. I own it now." Daniel stared, speechless. "And the company yard? Same thing. I didn't know until my team traced the chain of ownership." He pulled out 2 deeds and slid them across the table. "They're yours again, free and clear. You don't owe me anything. Just rebuild." Daniel's hands trembled as he picked up the papers. For the first time in years, his name was on something that mattered. The next morning, he stood at the gate of his old company yard. Weeds had taken over, the sign had faded, but he recognized every inch of it. He whispered to himself, "We're coming back." Back at Grace's house, Eli was already at the dining table, sketching blueprints. "If we rebuild the ramp here," he said, pointing to a drawing, "it'll be easier for guys in wheelchairs to get into the office." Daniel smiled. "You thinking of joining the crew?" "I'm thinking of running it," Eli said. Grace offered to help too, filing permits, organizing papers, calling old clients. She knew the business, and Daniel trusted her more than anyone. As word spread that Whitmore Construction was back, former clients reached out. Collins personally vouched for Daniel, landing them 2 small contracts to start. It wasn't glamorous work, patching roads, renovating a small clinic, but it was honest, and it paid. Every paycheck went into new equipment and hiring a crew. Daniel refused to cut corners. This time, he would do things by the book. At night, he stayed up reviewing old blueprints and writing out plans. Grace sat nearby, reading or helping Eli with homework. There was a quiet rhythm to their evenings, something peaceful Daniel hadn't known in years. But just as his life was stabilizing, news broke in San Antonio. Richard Hale had been arrested under a false identity. He'd been running scams in other states, supplying faulty materials and vanishing before lawsuits caught up to him. Daniel was called to testify. Standing in court, he laid out the facts: the delivery that ruined his biggest contract, the lies, the financial collapse, and how it all led to Eli's accident. Richard never looked at him. When the sentence came, fraud and conspiracy, years behind bars, Daniel didn't cheer. He just exhaled, as if a weight had finally lifted. Back home, Eli had something else to celebrate. After years of therapy, he walked 3 steps using crutches. Daniel cried quietly in the hallway, then walked into the living room with a proud smile. 3 today, he said, hugging his son. 100 tomorrow. Grace watched them from the kitchen, her heart full. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was recovery. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Clarissa Langston was living the life she thought she wanted. Since marrying David, she had embraced her new identity. There were penthouses in Miami, private yachts, dinners with city officials. She became the woman who waved to photographers and wore sunglasses indoors. She didn't ask about Daniel. She didn't wonder how Eli was doing. She had erased that chapter of her life. Until the diagnosis came. David had been feeling weak. Tests confirmed stage 3 pancreatic cancer. Aggressive, fast-moving, and expensive to treat. Clarissa's world shifted overnight. Yachts became hospitals. Champagne became pill bottles. Within weeks, the empire David built began to bleed money. His children from a previous marriage started circling. Clarissa smiled through it. She reminded herself that she made the right choice, that being by David's side, even now, was still better than living in a broken home with a crippled child and a bankrupt husband. But late at night in the sterile hospital rooms, when David coughed through his sleep and the nurses barely made eye contact, the silence crept in. She thought about the last thing she said to Daniel, "You're nothing but bad luck," and wondered for the first time in years if she had cursed herself in the process. Back in Houston, Daniel stood on the porch of the house he once lost. He held the deed in his hand and looked out at the lawn Eli used to play on. When he opened the door, dust and silence greeted him. But it was still home. Eli rolled in behind him, wide-eyed. "We're really back?" Daniel nodded. "No bank, no debt. Ours again." Grace stepped inside hesitantly, but Daniel turned to her and said, "You carried us when I couldn't carry myself. This is your home too." She didn't respond with words. She didn't need to. That night, the three of them ate dinner on the floor of the empty living room, using moving boxes as tables. Laughter echoed off the bare walls. For the first time in a decade, Daniel wasn't just surviving, he was living. A year after reclaiming his home and company, Daniel was back on construction sites. Not as a laborer scrambling to make ends meet, but as a leader rebuilding a reputation. Whitmore Construction, once a name buried under lawsuits and debt, was slowly becoming a symbol of resilience. They landed a major city contract thanks to Collins' endorsement. Daniel used it as a chance to prove himself. No shortcuts, no compromises. Every detail mattered. Eli, now 12, came to the site every afternoon after school. He wasn't just observing, he was learning. He asked questions about materials, studied blueprints, and even offered feedback on accessibility ramps. Daniel saw the future in his son's curiosity and drive. Grace, meanwhile, kept the home stable. She didn't hover, but she was always there when either of them needed grounding. As the business grew, so did the bond between them. There were late evenings when Grace stayed up with Daniel, helping him go over paperwork, and quiet mornings when she pushed Eli's wheelchair out into the sun so he could stretch before school. The unspoken trust between them deepened into something more. One evening, while Eli was asleep, Daniel found Grace in the backyard. She was watching the sky, lost in thought. He sat beside her and said, "You gave me more than help. You gave me back something I thought I lost. Hope." Grace didn't look away. "You gave me a reason to stay." That night, they didn't need to say anything else. While Daniel's life slowly rebuilt itself through consistency and love, Clarissa's was collapsing in silence. David's condition had worsened. No treatment slowed the cancer. The man who once signed checks without blinking now coughed up blood into tissues and whispered to doctors about wills. Clarissa tried to maintain control of the narrative, of the finances, but David's grown children weren't fooled. At the funeral, held at a grand estate outside Miami, Clarissa wore her best. She expected to be respected, maybe even comforted. But after the final prayer, David's eldest son approached her with no warmth in his voice. "You had your moment," he said, quietly but firmly. "But you were never one of us. The estate belongs to his blood, not to you." Clarissa's stomach dropped. "I'm his wife. You were his mistake," the son replied coldly. "Pack your things." By sunset, the locks had been changed, bank accounts frozen, credit cards shut off. She stood outside the penthouse with a suitcase and nowhere to go. It took everything she had not to scream. Clarissa returned to Houston because it was the only place left where she knew someone. She'd burned every bridge in Miami. She told herself she was just visiting, to gather her thoughts, maybe stay in a motel until she figured out her next move. But the truth had been forming in the back of her mind for weeks. She wanted to see Daniel again. She needed to. He had loved her once. Maybe he still did. Maybe there was still a way back. So she walked the old streets she used to own. The house looked different, better cared for. Lights glowed from inside, and the sound of laughter filtered through the windows. Her chest tightened. She took a breath and knocked. Daniel opened the door. He had aged, sure, but in a way that made him look steady, strong. Clarissa tried to smile. "It's me," she said. "I made mistakes, terrible ones, but I've changed. Please, let me come back." Before Daniel could speak, Eli appeared in the hallway. He was taller, standing with crutches now, no longer the small, helpless boy she had walked away from. His voice was calm but firm. "You left us," he said. "You called me a burden. Do you think we forgot?" Clarissa's voice cracked. "I was scared. I didn't know how to handle everything." "No," Eli said. "You didn't care. We've built a family without you. You're too late." Grace stepped into view, silent but present. She didn't gloat. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Daniel looked Clarissa in the eye. "You made your choice," he said, "and we made ours. My family is whole now. You don't belong here anymore." He closed the door, not in anger, but with quiet, final certainty. Clarissa stood on the porch, her suitcase at her feet, listening to the muffled sounds of life inside. The family she had once been part of now felt like a stranger's dream. She sank to the steps, her hands gripping the wood. "Daniel," she whispered, "I thought you'd save me. I thought I deserved better." But the door stayed shut. Inside, Eli leaned into his father. You okay? Daniel looked at Grace, then at his son. I am now. Clarissa didn't leave the porch right away. She sat there long after the door closed, frozen, as if time had paused just for her. The suitcase beside her remained untouched, her mind looping over Daniel's words. Not angry, not cruel, just final. The lights inside the house glowed warmly, and laughter drifted through the windows. It wasn't mocking, it wasn't performative, it was real. A kind of joy she hadn't heard in years. Not even in the penthouses, on the yachts, or at the rooftop parties with David. This was the sound of something whole. Clarissa finally stood, her legs shaky. She walked away from the house that used to be hers, but now belonged to someone else's life. There was no one waiting for her, no hotel reservation, no friend offering a couch. She spent that night at a shelter 2 blocks from downtown Houston. The next morning, she found work waiting tables in a rundown diner. It wasn't glamorous, but the manager needed someone immediately. The hours were long, the pay barely enough to cover a rented room, but she accepted it. There was no one left to rescue her. One afternoon, while pouring coffee for a truck driver, Clarissa looked up at the television bolted to the wall. A local news anchor smiled into the camera. Today, Whitmore Construction officially launched the new Houston City Center project, a major development expected to bring hundreds of jobs and billions in investment to the region. The camera cut to a stage. There was Daniel, standing in a sharp suit, shaking hands with the mayor. Colin stood beside him. Grace and the children sat in the front row. Eli, now nearly grown, stood tall, leaning casually on his crutches. He looked confident, grounded, nothing like the boy she remembered. The coffee pot slipped from her hand and clattered onto the counter. Several heads turned. Clarissa stood still, her eyes locked on the screen. Daniel smiled. Grace leaned into him, and Eli laughed at something the mayor said. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she walked to the public library and searched every article, every photo. Whitmore Construction was booming. Daniel was being celebrated across the state for his integrity and comeback story. Grace was listed not as a secretary or a helper, but as his wife, his partner. Clarissa stared at the wedding photo for a long time. It was small, intimate. Eli stood beside them, holding the rings. There was no grandeur, just love. For a week, she wrestled with herself. He loved me once. He could forgive me. He has to. People change. People deserve second chances. But deep down, she knew the truth. Forgiveness wasn't owed. Trust couldn't be demanded. And time had moved on without her. Back in Daniel's home, life was simple and full. The business kept him busy. Grace had returned to teaching part-time. Eli, now in high school, was preparing to apply for college with plans to study engineering. He talked about expanding the company one day, building accessible homes, making a difference for kids like himself. Daniel listened with pride, not just because Eli was walking more than ever, or because he was driven, but because he had grown up kind. The pain hadn't turned him bitter. On weekends, they took family trips to nearby parks. Grace packed lunches, Daniel drove, and Eli often navigated. There were no grand vacations or social media posts to prove their happiness. They simply lived it. One evening, Daniel came home to find Eli in the garage, working on a wooden model of the new office headquarters. Grace was helping paint it. Music played from a small speaker, and the air smelled of sawdust and fresh plans. Daniel watched them from the doorway. He didn't think about the past anymore. Not with resentment, at least. That chapter had closed the moment Clarissa walked away. And if there had been a lock on that door, Grace and Eli had been the key that kept it sealed. But a small envelope arrived a few days later. No return address. Inside was a letter, handwritten, shaky. I saw you on TV. You looked happy. I'm glad Eli's doing well. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that I was wrong. Daniel read it once, then twice. He folded it and placed it in the drawer beside his bed. He didn't show it to Grace. He didn't respond. Some debts couldn't be paid back with words. Months passed. The Houston City Center project took off. Daniel trained a new team of contractors, many of whom were veterans, single parents, or folks who had also hit rock bottom at some point. His second chance became a chain reaction for others who needed one. Meanwhile, Clarissa continued waiting tables. No one recognized her anymore. The diamonds were long gone. The dresses, the handbags, the invitations, all sold, pawned, or abandoned. Her hair was always tied back now, her nails chipped. The regulars at the diner didn't know her story. She didn't tell them. She often passed by construction sites on her way to the bus stop. When she saw the Whitmore logo on a truck or a crane, she turned her head. Daniel never saw her again. But Eli did. Once walking home from school with a group of friends, he spotted her clearing plates from a booth. She looked up, saw him, and froze. He didn't stop walking. He didn't wave, but their eyes met for a single moment. She didn't cry. She didn't follow him out. She simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the life she had left behind and the one he'd built without her. That night, Eli didn't mention it to his father. There was no need. 5 years had passed since Clarissa walked out, leaving behind a broken home and a paralyzed son. In that time, Daniel had rebuilt everything: his business, his family, and most importantly, himself. Whitmore Construction was thriving. What began with a single return deed and a second chance had grown into one of the city's most respected firms. Not because Daniel had chased revenge, but because he focused on values others had forgotten: honesty, grit, loyalty. The company didn't just build structures, it rebuilt lives. Daniel made a point of hiring people who needed a fresh start: single moms, former addicts, veterans trying to reintegrate. Eli, now in college, interned there during summers, learning every part of the business from the ground up. He still used crutches on long days, but most of the time he walked on his own. Daniel's relationship with Grace had deepened quietly over time. There was no need for grand gestures. They lived like a team, raising Eli, building a life, and supporting each other without pretense. When he finally asked her to marry him, it was on a quiet Sunday morning in the backyard. No cameras, no audience, just a question, and an answer that came with a smile and a nod. Their wedding was small, held in the same yard where they'd eaten dinner on moving boxes years before. Friends and co-workers filled the chairs. Collins was there, of course, still the man who had helped change Daniel's life, but now more like family. Eli stood beside his father during the vows. When the pastor asked if anyone had a blessing to offer the couple, Eli spoke without hesitation. "She's already been a mother to me," he said, "and I want her to be that forever." Grace's eyes filled with tears, and Daniel's voice caught for a moment as he said his vows. There were no promises of perfection, only of persistence, patience, and presence, the kind of love that survives storms and outlives regret. A year later, their daughter was born. Eli stood beside the hospital bed, holding his tiny sister, awe in his eyes. "I'll protect her," he whispered. Daniel, watching the two of them, felt a fullness in his chest he couldn't describe. It wasn't just about what he'd gained. It was about what he hadn't lost: his ability to love, to trust, to move forward. And far from that peaceful home, Clarissa lived a different story. She had never recovered what she lost: not the money, not the marriage, not the future she'd once imagined. After David's death and her eviction, she drifted. Cities blurred, jobs came and went. Eventually, she returned to Houston, not because she wanted to, but because she had nowhere else to go. She worked nights at a greasy diner. Her hands ached, her feet hurt. Tips were small and smiles were forced. She stayed quiet, kept to herself. Most of the staff didn't know her name, only that she showed up on time and didn't complain. Sometimes she passed the city center project, now a bustling district of parks, offices, and storefronts. The Whitmore Construction plaque sat on a polished stone at the entrance. She avoided it, but couldn't stop herself from looking when she passed. One afternoon, she was restocking condiments when the TV above the bar played a local news segment. "Whitmore Construction has announced their latest initiative," the anchor said. "A scholarship fund for children with disabilities, named in honor of Eli Whitmore, son of company founder Daniel Whitmore. The first recipient, a 10-year-old boy with cerebral palsy, will be able to attend a private school specializing in physical therapy and mobility training." Clarissa froze. The screen showed a brief clip of Eli shaking the child's hand, smiling. Grace stood beside him. Daniel's arm rested around her shoulders. Clarissa turned away. That night, she walked to the house again. Not to ask for anything, not to beg. She stood across the street, hidden in the shadows. The porch light glowed. Laughter drifted out into the night. A child's giggle. The sound hit her like a wave. She watched for a moment, then walked away. This time, she didn't hesitate. She didn't knock. She didn't cry. The truth had settled into her chest in a way no apology could fix. She had traded love for luxury, and in the end, she had neither. Daniel never spoke of her again. Grace never asked. Eli had long since made peace with her absence. They didn't need to relive what they had survived. Their home was full, their hearts were steady, and every nail hammered, every blueprint drawn, every lesson taught in that home stood on a foundation built not of revenge, but of redemption.